Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, and then distill from them information, ideas, concepts that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices in order to make them go better. So I don't remember if I mentioned this last week, kicking off the 2026 season 4 of the show. Wow. But, having spent 16 years in the United States Navy with the tremendous support that I received from you, my fellow citizens, as well as my colleagues in the military, this is a way for me to give back to you something of what you gave me. I will tell you, just to share a brief personal note, out of the blue, I believe it was on Friday of last week, I got an email from a shipmate from when I was deployed in 2011 on the USS Ronald Reagan. And it was very touching. He had some unfortunate things happen to him. He was really struggling during the deployment, and he came to see me. As many of you know, I was a chaplain in the military, and we talked a number of times. And typically that's kind of it. I never know what happens. So here is this young sailor. Now it's 14, 15 years later. He's happily married, and he's in civilian life, and really, he's been able to recover and move on from those troubles. Extremely gratifying to know that is the case. And so in a way, this is me kind of continuing my chaplaincy, if you will. So last week, I started a 4-episode track, if you will, talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan, and in particular, his book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, which he wrote in 1890. It is one of the most influential books on navies and sea power, and indeed one of the most influential books dealing with the military of all time. And it was read not just by people in the United States Navy and civilian naval leadership here in the United States, but it was read and consumed, and the ideas were adopted really all over the world, including Japan and European nations, etc. So it's hard to overestimate the impact that Mahan had by writing this book. And to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever broken down the concepts that he talked about and applied them to businesses. Although, as these episodes are titled, How Empires and Companies Rise and Fall. So I wouldn't say that countries are literally the equivalent of companies or vice versa, but there are a lot of parallels. I was having this conversation with my friend Michael last night. We meet almost every Monday night, have now for 6 or 7 years, I believe, at this point. And the reality is the United States this year is celebrating its 250th birthday. We were trying to come up with countries, specifically as they're currently being governed, that have been around longer than the United States. So Great Britain, of course, has been around a long, long time. One could make the argument that it's been kind of the same government since 1066, Magna Carta, although not strictly so. It transitioned from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy during that, roughly 1,000 years. The French Republic postdates the United States by a few years. The French Revolution actually occurred after the American Revolution. Um, Germany, was really not a modern nation state until the latter part of the 19th century. Italy, somewhat similar. China, in its current iteration, was founded in 1949 with the takeover of the country by communist forces. Japan too was largely rebuilt post World War II. So while there are probably some, perhaps smaller countries that maybe have been around as long as the United States, not a whole lot. And kind of the major players on the field today, not a lot of them. The U.S., Russia, right? Russian Revolution, 1917, overturned by 1991. Again, so the major players, the United States at this point, I think has the longest history. So companies too, they're built. They exist for a while. They fall. There are companies that have been around for a long, long time. There's an Italian perfume company, Sant Novella, that's been around for roughly, I believe it's 800 years. There are other European companies that have been around for literally centuries, but they're rather the exception to the rule. And companies are created, built. They most don't last for a very long time. So there's kind of a cycle would be the wrong word, but a sort of I don't know what you would call it, a process by which companies are built, they last, and then they decline and move off the stage of commerce, if you will. So that's why I decided to use Alfred Thayer Mahan's work as the basis for a discussion about how empires and companies rise and fall. So I talked in episode 1 about 5 concepts. Sea power is a system, not a fleet. Trade follows security. Geography creates opportunity and constraint. Long-term strategy beats tactical wins, and national policy shapes commercial success. So those are the 5 I talked about in episode 1. In episode 2, I've got 5 more about which I'm going to talk. And let's start off with control of trade routes equals control of wealth. So this is something that Mahan saw, I would say, both with respect to the Royal Navy, the Navy of Great Britain, and to a lesser extent because of the time that he was, the United States Navy really wasn't on the stage at the time that he was writing, but clearly Great Britain was the dominant economic power in the world at this time. There were other countries that certainly had prominence, among them the Dutch, the Spanish, although not at anything like their former glory, the French. Those were probably the major powers at the time. But there's no doubt that because of the strength of the Royal Navy, that Great Britain controlled, in many cases, trade routes and therefore controlled wealth. And so, the Royal Navy was not selfish in the sense of they controlled trade routes purely for the benefit of Great Britain. What the Royal Navy sought to create was freedom of navigation, so that uh, so that people could, ply the seas, so to speak, free of things like piracy and such that that made it difficult for companies to conduct international trade. And so, in many ways, um, England's dominance of trade routes and the control of wealth that it gained by doing so, it was almost more economic warfare, if kind of capital W warfare, than it was decisive combat actions. So countries recognized the strength of the Royal Navy, and they realized that they were not going to be able to successfully challenge it, and so they didn't. Right? And of course, the reason that Great Britain could maintain such a powerful navy was it had the wealth, the economic vitality to do so. Now, it's interesting to note that the transition of power from Great Britain to the United States, starting at the beginning, roughly the beginning of the 19th century, had at its genesis the ability of the United States Navy to challenge the Royal Navy, initially and primarily in waters adjacent to the United States, but even in local waters. I would recommend to you the show that I did on John Paul Jones, in the battle with the Serapis and the Bonhomme Richard, that I did, I believe, last year. Right, so the American Navy was able to sort of take it to Great Britain with the help of the French, to be sure, but that was the beginning, and it was a small beginning, to be sure, of the loss of the Royal Navy's control of trade routes. Okay, so how does this apply then to business? Well, control of distribution really creates a durable advantage. I think the best place that we see this is with a company like Amazon, right? So I can't tell you exactly what the percentage is, but a lot of what is sold on Amazon is actually sold by independent merchants. Okay, but Amazon has such a powerful distribution system between its website and its logistical support, etc., that it is absolutely dominant in the retail space. Now, after a long time of being an also ran, Walmart is starting to challenge Amazon, right? And so these are kind of the two big competitors in this space, and it'll be interesting to watch this play out. Now, that's, kind of on the huge macro side. So what does this mean for us who have small businesses? We're not going to dominate distribution, for example, if we're a retailer, right? So what we have to do is find a way to sort of dominate in our niche, so that, in essence, we have a platform that cannot be, to use a Navy term, sunk, right, by a larger competitor, either because the resources it would have to expend relative to what it could gain by doing so do not make it worthwhile, or they're actually benefiting from the strength of our small platform within the larger ecosystem, perhaps of distribution and logistics that they've created. I'm going to talk about logistics next. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, I'll going to talk about an example from my own practice. So, uh, the end of last year, I needed to do payroll for my company, and since I use ADP, the largest payroll service provider in the world, I thought, well, I'll just use it for my company. And too, I just have one employee, one W-2 employee anyway, me. But what the heck, I'll just hire them. It probably won't cost that much, and and be done with it. And kind of in the event, because I started the process in December, after consulting with my accountant and him telling me what I needed to do, uh, came a few days before the end of the year, and ADP dropped the ball on me, right? And so here's a company with platform distribution, if you will, dominance, right? Largest payroll company in the world, right? They dropped the ball on me. And so I made a frantic contact to my accountant and said, "Hey, what do I do?" He said, "I don't do payroll, but here's someone who does." Her name is Tammy Seidling. I'm going to give her a a plug here, because what Tammy does is, although she's certainly tiny compared to ADP, she's created a platform within her accounting and bookkeeping business. She's not a CPA, regular accounting and bookkeeping business, so that she can compete effectively with the behemoths. And especially for a small business owner like me, I can send her an email. I'll get a response usually pretty quickly, certainly within, a few hours. Okay. And if need be, we can get on the phone and have a conversation without the hassle of trying to find someone at a huge company with whom to speak. Here's the kicker. She can do my payroll for less than what ADP would charge me, right? So this is what I mean by control of trade routes, kind of um, redefining that into the business sphere. Tammy has created a platform, and it's really kind of a series of technology solutions, if you will, that she's put together that create the situation where she can act quickly, effectively, and provide a level of service that the huge competitors just they're not going to deliver. First of all, they're just not going to care as much as Tammy does, because it's her own business. Okay. So that's what we can do to create our control of trade routes. We can offer something that even huge competitors cannot. Okay, next. Choke point, logistics are a strategic weapon. Okay. So fleets failed when the supply lines to them collapsed. Okay. Now, picture a fleet back in the 17th, 18th century. We're talking about square rigged sailing ships, right? The distances were long. The speeds at which ships could sail was relatively slow compared to today. Okay. And yet they had to be supplied. Okay. And while for the most part these ships brought their own supplies with them, if it was the Royal Navy and they were on station in the Caribbean, so they might supply ships would periodically, be sent out to resupply them so that they could stay on station and not have to go back. Okay. And because the British Navy, the Royal Navy, had the ability to do that. They were able to project naval strength much more effectively than navies that didn't have that resupply ability. Okay. And so the robust logistical support that the Royal Navy had, okay, allowed them to endure far away from home ports and keep that power projected. Okay. So here's the reality then for a business, right? So reliability will beat innovation when it can't scale. So we can come up with all kinds of new stuff, but if we're able to deliver effectively day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out, okay, and what we're delivering is something that people need, that is going to be far more effective than if we come up with some spanking new product that maybe will sort of catch people's eyes for a while, but then, they're looking for the next hot thing. Okay. And so, uh, these traits that I just mentioned, things like reliability, um, really make a difference, especially for us small businesses. Can we? What I've found is oftentimes I just, as a small business, can't really rely on large organizations. I'm not, and look, there, it makes perfect sense. I'm not large enough that if they lose my business in the end, they really care, right? Because I'm a micro factor of a percent of their business, right? And so, and they don't make enough off of my business to spend a lot of money supporting it. Okay. So, whereas if I'm doing business with, as I mentioned, Tammy, okay. So, I'm not saying I'm an appreciable percentage of her business either, but I'm a much larger percentage of her business than I am of a large company's business. Okay. Same with my bank. Okay. My bank is, I bank with a boutique business bank here in Los Angeles called American Business Bank. Okay. They have one branch downtown and they are very, very good at what they do. Okay. In fact, right before I started this show, I sent an email to my banker because I want to have him come on one of my other shows, Trust and Estates Weekly, and talk about how they do banking so well. Okay. Because I've been with Wells Fargo, I've been with US Bank, would never bank with them again. I am too insignificantly tiny a fraction of their business for them to really care about helping me solve the problems that arise in my business. And indeed, in the past, they've been a source of problems for me. They've created problems for me. Okay. American Business Bank, or for them as ABB. Okay. They're up front. They told me when I was first introduced bank, we're not always going to be able to solve your problems, but we are going to do our best to help you solve them. Okay. And you're going to get a straight answer from us. And I can pick up the phone and call my banker and I can have a conversation with David. And if we can work it out, we can. And if we can't, this is one thing I know. One of the large money center banks is not going to be able to help me either. Okay. That's just the reality of the situation. And I'm never going to have a relationship where I can call up my own banker at a bank like whatever it is, Bank of America, Citibank. Okay. I'm too small for them. Okay. So these are the kinds of things that we can do. We can create a reliable business or product, okay, where that reliability allows us to support the operations, the needs, however we would describe them, of our customers in a way that we're important in their life, were important to their success. So I believe it was investment banker by the name of Felix Roy Hatton who once said, if you want to be successful in business, make yourself indispensable to your clients and customers. We can do that through logistics, not the logistics for our own business, but the sort of logistical support writ large that we give to our clients and customers. We can be the service provider or product provider that they know they can always count on. Okay, let's take a break and come back and talk some more. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. Okay, so the third idea that I want to share with you today from Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power upon History is choke points decide outcomes. Okay, so in a naval context, okay, narrow passengers concentrate power and risk. Okay, so we can see this in many places throughout the world. Think of the Straits of Gibraltar, which is at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, England had to take control, from its perspective, had to take control of the Straits of Gibraltar in order to maintain its naval dominance. Okay. The Suez Canal is another choke point. When the Houthis were lobbing missiles at ships traversing the Suez Canal, it became untenable for cargo ships to use that what amounted to a choke point. As a result, instead of taking that shortcut up the Suez Canal, they had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern end of Africa, elongating the time it took for them to get from one point to another, and significantly increasing the cost of seaborne transit. Okay, those are just two examples. I could give examples in Eastern Asia as well, where here's one: the Straits of Hormuz, right, in the Persian Gulf, right? I've traversed the Straits of Hormuz. I did so when I was on my ship that I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the USS Ronald Reagan. And there's a game that the Iranian Navy plays with U.S. ships that are transversing the straits, and that is they send these little patrol boats out with their machine guns unlimbered, like they're going to attack us, a nuclear aircraft carrier, right? And so then the captain of the ship sends down crew members to unlimber our 50 caliber twin, machine guns. And these little Iranian patrol boats, they sort of play chicken. They get as close to the boat as they think they can without getting blasted out of the water, essentially. And then they go back to their port and they say, oh, we really harassed, the United States Navy, right? It's silliness. But the fact of the matter is, the United States has for a long, long time maintained at least one aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf to see to it that oil leaving our allied countries in that region have freedom of the seas so they can transport their oil. Now you might say, well, wait, why would we want that? Let their oil be bottled up and then we can sell our oil more expensively. Well, there's a balance, because high energy prices it caused the cost of all kinds of goods to increase, right? And so better to let the oil markets operate relatively free flow, and that way oil prices can settle where they're best meeting market demand. That's a more effective way to deal with it. Okay, but choke points give navies an opportunity to create to decide outcomes, basically. Okay, and those outcomes may or may not be favorable to a particular country. Okay, and the other thing is, small forces at a choke point can exercise an outsized influence. Okay, now Iranian little patrol boats are not going to stop a U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier. Okay, but they were successful in capturing some small U.S. patrol boats that were on I believe it was the western shore of the straits at one point. They took some sailors captive, right? And it was a big incident at the time. Okay, so choke points give an opportunity to create a power advantage that wouldn't exist but for that choke point. Okay, so how do we deal with so-called choke points? Well, we may not call them choke points. We may call them bottlenecks in supply, in data, even in regulation. So we see this in particular here in California, where the regulations to build housing are so difficult. We have a huge housing shortage. I've heard it estimated as high as 600,000 units. Now, in a state that has a population of whatever California is, 10, 20 million people, that may not sound like a lot, but it is. Okay. And the housing shortage is profound in California, and it's driven housing prices up very high, right? What is the bottleneck? It's not a magic, there's no magic formula. It's that it is so costly and time consuming to get entitlements to build housing that unless you're going to build a very expensive home, it's hard to justify the cost of going through that entitlement process. Okay, even when there's government incentives to offset the bottleneck, a lot of times it's still not worth it, right? And so this is what we have to look at in our own business. Where are the bottlenecks that we face? Now, I know for myself, because I'm a small business, I don't have resources for, political lobbying and that sort of thing. So I eschew, as much as I possibly can, anything that involves having to deal with the government, because so much of how governments operate these days come down to being able to lobby them successfully. I'll give you a small example from when I had my prior real estate company business. I think I've told this story before, maybe not on this show. Maybe it was on People Making Money. But my cousin and I at the time were working on a small development project. And like any development project, and it was residential. We were intending to build, I think it was 4 to 6 loft, residences in an old storage building, moving and storage building, up in Eagle Rock, to be precise. So anytime a developer is going to do that, he basically needs the blessing of the councilman for that district. And so my cousin set up a time for us to meet with the councilman for that district. Don't remember what his name was, but he was smart enough to talk with the head of the neighborhood homeowners association in advance of that meeting to see if she was on board with what we wanted to do. And here's why. So the two of us show up at the meeting. We're at the councilman's office. They take us in the conference room. And interestingly enough, the councilman himself was not there. Okay, now this was a think it was going to be like a $3 million development. So it wasn't huge, but it was certainly big enough to take the councilman's notice, but he was not there. So we which is what we had thought was going to happen. His staff was there. And we're sitting and we make our presentation about what we're going to do. And the staffers say to us, well, we're not really sure whether we should recommend this to the council member or not. And we said, well, what would motivate you to recommend that the council member get behind our project? They said, well, the council member has an election coming up, right? You hear what they're asking for? They're asking for a campaign contribution, right? Now you can say, oh, that's completely sleazy and scummy, and I would agree with you, and that is the way the process works here in the city of Los Angeles. Rather than play that game, my cousin Ross said, I think there's someone that you need to speak to. There was a speakerphone console sitting in the middle of the table. Without asking permission, he dialed the telephone number of the president of the Homeowners Association. And she gets on the line. He says, hi, I don't remember her name, June, whatever her name was. This is Ross. Oh, hey, Ross, how you doing? Great. He said, we're sitting here with the council member staff. I think I mentioned we were going to be meeting with them today. She said, oh, yeah. And he said, would you tell the council member staff your thoughts on what we discussed earlier this week? She said, be happy to. She said, the members of the homeowners group, they want the councilmen to be behind this project. We want this project. It'll be a benefit for our neighborhood. We've talked with Ross and Kevin extensively, and the council member needs to get behind this. Right? So we had to outflank him. Otherwise, we would have had that bottleneck, and we would have been having to, make donations to this council member's reelection committee in order to get them to get behind our project. So that's what I mean by identifying choke points in our businesses and doing what we can to either mitigate the choke points or control the choke points. Now, I don't know. Did we mitigate or did we control that particular, choke point in the story I just told? I'll leave it for you to decide. But in one way or another, they have to be dealt with. We can't ignore them because they can destroy our businesses. Okay, and so we've got to learn what are the choke points. How do we deal with them effectively? Okay, number 4. The interdependence of commerce and protection. So there is, especially with the Royal Navy, which is, again, it was the dominant sea power at the time that Mahan, was not writing his book, but that was the dominant navy during the time period that Mahan covered in his book. So there was a very interesting sort of symbiotic relationship. So merchant fleets required protection by navies, in this case, the Royal Navy. But the Royal Navy also needed merchant fleets in order to get supplies to distant ports so that they could stay on station. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship that merchant fleets and navies had. And it was that interdependence that made them strong. So in the same way, okay, when we look at a similar issue from a business perspective, right? Growth and risk need to scale together, okay? So last week on my show, People Making Money, I talked about essentially scaling too fast. And I used as the example Krispy Kreme, which had done went through a huge growth period in the very early 2000s to the point that they outstripped their ability to provide the kind of products that people had come to love about Krispy Kremes. They were not able to deliver on their promise, and the whole thing basically fell apart. Krispy Kreme ended up having to shutter hundreds, if not thousands, of locations and really go back to sort of core principles, right? So they overexpanded without the safeguards that were necessary to protect what it was that was so attractive about Krispy Kreme, which is, of course, those amazingly delicious glazed donuts, not to mention all the other flavors, right? So as we look at our businesses, as we look at, for example, growing our businesses, okay, how do we create an interdependent relationship between what we need to sustain the growth and what those things that are necessary to sustain the growth need from us? Okay, so I'm going to go back to my example of my having to do payroll the end of last year, right? It almost turned into a disaster for me. If I hadn't been able to get my payroll done before year end, I would have owed a lot more taxes. And in so doing, I would have reduced the resources that I had available to myself, for myself to live and for my business to operate and grow in this year. Okay, because I would have had to pay it to Uncle Sam instead. By creating an interdependent relationship with Tammy, okay, who cares about me as an individual business owner, right? So on the one hand, I now don't have to worry about payroll anymore. Tammy has it, right? Once a year, the beginning of December, I'll give her the numbers that my accountant gives me for doing my payroll for the year. I'm done. Don't have to worry about it. I can count on her support. Tammy can count on regular payments from me. Okay. We're set. It's all set up to be automatic. So she doesn't have to worry about chasing me down to get an invoice paid. Nope, not at all. Number one. And number two, we've already discussed one potential source of additional business for her. It wasn't something that she did. But yesterday I emailed her about another potential source of business for her. So I'm a big believer in creating interdependence, because this is what allows the entire tide to rise. And so that's what we have to look for in our businesses. Where are there, small businesses especially, where are there opportunities for us to create interdependent relationships that then provide mutual support for both sides to grow? Okay? All right. Finally, scale enables endurance. Okay? So large economies, from an Enable's perspective, large economies can absorb losses that smaller powers cannot. Okay? Again, one of the reasons why the Royal Navy and Great Britain were able to be so dominant for so long was they had probably the largest economy in the world. This is before the time we measured GDP and all this kind of stuff, but almost for sure, Great Britain, a tiny island nation by any measure, in terms of the world, had an outsized effect because it had such a huge economy that could then provide the funds that were necessary to pay for a very strong navy, but also because it could support a huge merchant fleet. Okay. Smaller powers just couldn't. Germany, it was not a unified nation during this time. And although it had aspirations, or different parts of Germany had aspirations to have an impact on the world stage, it could not. Okay, it just didn't have a large enough, strong enough economy to challenge Great Britain. That was one of the reasons for World War I. Is Kaiser Wilhelm thought that at that point in history, the early 20th century, now Germany is unified. He was the leader of a unified Germany, that he had the kind of economic power that would allow him to challenge the biggest powers of the day, including France, Great Britain, and in so doing, kind of right what he felt was the slights he received from these other countries, right? And in the event, it turned out not to be the case. Okay, Germany was just not a large enough economy to be able to absorb the losses that the Allies, especially once the United States joined World War I in 1917, Germany just could not sustain the losses. And by the way, a similar thing happened in World War II, with the United States being what was called the arsenal for a democracy, and then once Russia was able to build up its industrial prowess, there was no way Germany was going to win. Germany by itself could not outproduce the United States, let alone the United States and Russia. So even though France's industrial strength was basically, taken over by Germany, and England's was not particularly large at that point, although it did add to the materiel available to the Allies. Germany just could not overcome that disadvantage. Okay, and so attrition favors the well-resourced. So I'll use an example from World War II. So the tanks that Germany built, the Tiger tanks in particular, were much more powerful than the American Sherman tanks and the T-34s that Russia was building. Okay, they were a much better tank when all is said and done, according to a lot of military historians. The problem for Germany was it could not produce them at a high enough rate to overcome the massive numbers of Sherman tanks and T-34s that were being produced by the United States and Russia, respectively. Okay, and so in essence, multiple Shermans would overwhelm one Tiger tank, right? And that became, so that scale enabled the ability to produce at scale is what enabled the Allies to win World War II. Okay, so how do we apply this then to our businesses? Well, number one, cash reserves equal the ability to continue operating and competing. Okay, so it's critically important, especially for those of us who have small businesses and practices, that we have significant cash reserves available, right? Because there will be times when we may lose a client or more than one client. There may be downtimes when a business dries up. COVID is the ideal example. I was talking to a friend of mine. His name is Reggie. He's the area manager for this clothing store that I go to called 11T. And I dropped by the store. I had just gone for a haircut. Can you see my hair is shorter than it was last week, right? And I met he asked me, kind of what I was up to. I said, "Oh, I just got a haircut." He said, and I kind of pointed to where my barber is. He says, "Everybody always points to a haircut over there." And I said, yeah, the Barber Lab is there. So Barber Lab is owned by my friend Jesse Cantillo. Now, I met Jesse I think maybe the year before COVID hit in 2020. I mean, I met him in 2019, a year before COVID hit in 2020. Now, if you remember during COVID, hairstylists and barbers and such, they were practically dead in the water because essentially, I know in the city of Beverly Hills, which is where Jesse had his shop and still does, uh, basically the word went out, you can't see customers. What is a small business to do? Okay. And so, from Jesse's perspective, fortunately, he had some reserves on hand, and then he had some customers like me who basically went to him and said, okay, how can we help you get through this? How can we build up your reserves? Right. And so a bunch of us paid for haircuts in advance so he had the cash to carry him through. Otherwise, it's, doubtful whether he would have made it. Okay. And it would be a shame. Greatest barber I ever had. Okay. I'm giving plugs to a lot of businesses today, I guess. But whatever. My point in telling the story is, who anticipated that COVID was going to happen? And COVID having happened, who would have anticipated that it was essentially going to shut down commerce? Okay. So while maybe we're not going to have enough reserves on hand that will sustain our business, our small business, if it's shut down for 6 months, we should probably have enough on hand that if our business is shut down for 1 to 3 months, at least 1 to 3 months, we can get through it and then rebuild, right? And so cash reserves mean strategic freedom to a business, okay? And the flip side is, if we have very thin margins, okay, this will tend to magnify risk over time, because if the cost of our inputs goes up, our margins disappear. If marketing costs have to be increased to sustain our position in the market, our margins disappear, right? Any change in the financial picture for our business means margins will disappear if we're starting out with thin margins. And so we have to be mindful of that in order for us to sustain our businesses. Okay, so reviewing real quickly the 5 concepts that I covered today, based on Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Okay, control of trade routes equals control of wealth. Logistics are strategic weapons. Choke points decide outcomes. Independence of commerce, and the interdependence of commerce and protection. And finally, scale enables endurance. If we apply these principles to our businesses, we will be more likely to be successful. We will build an enduring business, maybe one that will one day celebrate its 250th birthday, like the United States of America. So thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. I wish you tomorrow at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And then on Thursday at 5 p.m. is my show, Jiggers' Place. Okay. Hope you'll join me later in the week. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your viewership. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, links to my social media will be in the show notes when the episode posts on YouTube. Happy to hear from you. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my best.